A warehouse filled with millions of dollars in salad oil sounds boring. Until you realize most of it was water. And until you realize that some of the most powerful banks in the world inspected it, approved it, financed it, and never noticed. This wasn't a street scam. This wasn't a loophole. This was a deception so simple that it slipped past auditors, regulators, insurers, and Wall Street itself. And once you understand how it worked, you'll start recognizing the same pattern everywhere today. Because this scam didn't rely on technology. It relied on trust, authority, and one dangerous assumption that someone else already checked. In the early 1960s, vegetable oil wasn't just a cooking ingredient, it was a financial asset. Salad oil futures were actively traded, prices were volatile, and companies were making fortunes by buying, storing, and reselling massive quantities of oil. At the center of this booming market was a man named Anthony Tino de. On paper, he was a success story, a charismatic businessman, deeply connected, politically active, and running what appeared to be one of the largest salad oil operations in the United States. His company claimed to control enormous reserves of oil stored in warehouses across New Jersey, and those reserves were the foundation of everything that followed. Here's the promise that sold the illusion. DeAngelis told banks and trading firms that he had massive quantities of salad oil safely stored in tanks. That oil was collateral, real, tangible, verifiable. Banks loved this kind of deal. Commodity-backed loans felt safe. If something went wrong, the oil could be sold. The risk appeared minimal. So institutions lined up. They didn't just lend him money. They competed to lend him money. Millions turned into tens of millions, and then hundreds of millions. Now here's where the story quietly becomes insane. The oil was stored in large tanks inside warehouses. Inspectors were sent. Auditors showed up. Insurance companies verified the inventory. Everyone did their job, or at least everyone believed someone else had, because inside those tanks, floating at the top, was a thin layer of real salad oil, and underneath it was mostly water. Salad oil floats, water doesn't. And almost no one thought to check below the surface. This is the moment to pause, because this is the heart of the scam. There was no complex financial engineering, no fake documents that required deep forensic analysis. Just basic physics, a visual illusion, a thin layer of truth covering a massive lie. And that was enough. The tanks looked full, the oil was visible. The paperwork matched, confidence spread. Banks issued loans based on those tanks. Trading firms accepted warehouse receipts as proof of inventory. Insurance companies insured oil that barely existed. Each institution trusted the previous one. Authority replaced verification. And this is the psychological loop that made the scam scale. Once reputable banks were involved, others followed. If they approved it, it must be real. If it's insured, it must be verified. If it's audited, it must be accurate. At no point did most players independently confirm reality. By the time the scheme reached its peak, DeAngelis had leveraged these fake reserves into an estimated $150 million in loans. In 1963, that was an enormous sum. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking well over $1 billion today. The market believed the oil existed, prices responded. Trading volumes adjusted. Entire segments of the commodities market were distorted by oil that was mostly water. But like all illusions, this one depended on silence and stability. The moment scrutiny increased, the structure became fragile. Questions began to surface. Not because someone suddenly became smarter, but because the system experienced stress. When some lenders started asking for repayment, the timing problem emerged. DeAngelis couldn't move oil that wasn't there. He couldn't sell inventory that didn't exist. And eventually, someone did what almost no one had done before. They drained the tanks. What they found was devastating. Tank after tank revealed a thin top layer of oil, sometimes just inches thick, floating on massive volumes of water. The collateral vanished instantly. Banks realized their loans were unsecured. Insurance companies faced catastrophic exposure. Trading firms discovered their receipts were worthless. Panic spread fast. The fallout was immediate and brutal. American Express, through its subsidiary that insured the oil, took a massive hit. Banks suffered enormous losses. The commodities market reeled. DeAngelis was arrested and convicted, but the damage was already done. Trust had collapsed. And once again, the public narrative focused on one villain, one warehouse, one moment. But that misses the real lesson. The salad oil scandal didn't work because people were careless. It worked because the system rewarded assumption over verification. It worked because complexity wasn't required. It worked because no one wanted to be the person who slowed things down by asking obvious questions. And here's the promise I made earlier. The reason this story matters today is because the same structure keeps repeating. Replace oil tanks with balance sheets. Replace warehouses with digital dashboards. Replace physical inspections with screenshots, dashboards, and third-party assurances. Modern scams don't need to hide water under oil. They hide emptiness under activity. They show surface-level proof and rely on authority to carry the rest. Crypto platforms show yield dashboards backed by nothing. Investment funds display steady returns that are never independently verified. Startups, flash partnerships, logos, and testimonials that no one checks deeply. And just like in 1963, the question isn't whether the surface looks convincing. The question is what's underneath. The salad oil scandal teaches a brutal truth. Most fraud doesn't require brilliance. It requires patience and confidence. It requires understanding that people trust systems more than they trust their own doubts. And once enough reputable names are attached, the illusion becomes self-sustaining. Anthony DeAngelis didn't invent deception. He exploited a gap between appearance and reality. A gap that still exists. A gap that keeps getting wider as systems become more abstract and harder to physically inspect. The warehouse full of water wasn't an anomaly. It was a warning. And if you want to understand how financial fraud actually works, not just in history, but right now, this channel exists for that reason. Because the next scandal won't involve salad oil, but it will involve the same mistake. Subscribe if you want to see what's floating on top before the tanks are drained.